the fragrance with Scentbird. So a big reason why the American presidential election is being studied so closely here in Canada is because we will be having our own prime ministerial election in less than a year's time. As we know from my recent award-winning video on the topic, the Canadian election is currently scheduled for October of 2025, but it is possible it could wind up being several months earlier if the Parliament votes no confidence in Prime Minister Trudeau, or if Prime Minister Trudeau just decides to reschedule it earlier, as he has the power to do. Which leads us into the first question to ponder: what does Trump's victory mean for Trudeau? Prime Minister Trudeau is quite unpopular right now, and is widely expected to lose his bid for a fourth term whenever the election winds up happening. And for a long time, it seemed like the only thing that could possibly alter this fate would be if some big, dramatic thing happened that radically altered the Canadian political landscape in his favor. Does Trump returning to the White House rise to that level of an event? I used to think so, but now I'm not so sure. If Trump had been elected in a very narrow way, like he was in 2016, I think it is possible that Trudeau could use the shock of that victory to make himself look more attractive by comparison. You know, a symbol of Canadian stability in contrast to the wild fluctuations of the American political system. If Trump then proceeded to use his thin mandate to govern in an extreme or cruel or chaotic way, it would be similarly easy for Trudeau to portray himself as a calm and compassionate alternative. And Trudeau could paint his rival, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, as basically a Trump in waiting who would inflict a similarly destructive style of government on Canada. And yet, I now feel it is easier to second-guess some of those assumptions. The fact that Trump won as decisively as he did makes it clear that a lot of Americans were very hungry for change. They didn't trust their incumbent administration, and even though it was pretty obvious all of the ways that the leader of the out party would be an agent of chaos and pain, it still wasn't enough to persuade voters to turn against him. You might have seen this chart from the Financial Times going around. It illustrates how in every election held in every major country around the world this year, the governing party has seen their share of the vote decline, leading to a broad wave of losses for incumbents. And this tends to be framed as the grim final act of the COVID era. Most countries experienced a lot of economic hardship during the pandemic and its aftermath, and the ruling parties were accordingly punished by voters at the first chance that they got. Both Canada and the US experienced high levels of inflation due to government attempts to mitigate the economic fallout of the COVID crisis. And I feel like it has already become conventional wisdom in many circles that Trump's re-election should be primarily understood as an expression of anger at the high cost of living this inflation produced. For the last few years, Canada's economy has been consistently performing worse than the US, especially when it comes to inflation and cost of living. So if post-COVID economic pain is indeed the defining issue of the Western world, there is basically zero reason to expect Trudeau to be able to pull off a victory under these conditions when no other world leader was able to. Now, a lot of Canadians really do not like Donald Trump, though probably less than is often assumed, which we will discuss more later. But in any case, the fact that his re-election was so upsetting to so many people up here makes it, on the one hand, perfectly rational for Trudeau's campaign to seek to portray Pierre as a kind of mini-Trump. But on the other hand, we have to remember that Prime Minister Trudeau will also have to work with President Trump in the months leading up to the Canadian election. And this might make the Prime Minister a little bit wary about making overtly anti-Trump politics part of his personal brand. I mean, preserving the stability of the US-Canada partnership is basically the only real goal of Canadian foreign policy. So why bother provoking a president known to be, let us just say, a little bit sensitive? Trump had a basically good relationship with Trudeau the first time around, certainly better than he had with many other world leaders. But Trump is now under greater influence of men like Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson, who hate Trudeau quite openly, in part because they see him as being indistinguishable from the American left, which of course they hate with the fury of 1,000 suns. The guy who Trump appointed to be his new national security advisor has likewise been quite outspoken in his opposition to Trudeau and support of Pierre. Again, because a lot of American conservatives have come to understand Trudeau as an enemy they recognize. We even saw a glimpse of Trump's anti-Trudeau radicalization during the campaign when he spouted a notorious anti-Trudeau conspiracy theory during his live stream with Aidan Ross.
Yeah, he's turned very liberal, actually. They say he's the son of Fidel Castro, and could be. I mean, anything's possible in this world, you know? I get along with him very well, actually, but he seems to be going very progressive.
Trump has also promised that he will level tariffs on all foreign goods, which Trudeau will have to try to talk Trump out of during his renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Deal, which is something else that Trump wants to do. So when we consider all of this, there is probably less political space for Trudeau to turn the Canadian election into a referendum on Trump per se. Trudeau will probably be more keen to portray himself as someone who knows how to handle Trump and point to the trade agreement that they negotiated in 2018 as proof of their good working relationship. If anything, I think it is very possible that Trudeau could face some flack from Canadian progressives and the further left New Democratic Party for not going after Trump hard enough in his re-election campaign. You can imagine him being in a sort of difficult pincher type scenario where people on his left will want him to denounce Trump explicitly, while people on his right will be super critical of anything that he says or does that's seen as threatening Canada's US interests. He experienced something similar when he ran for his second term in 2019, the only other election he has faced while Trump has been in power. Now, of course, the US election wasn't just about Trump, it was also about Kamala Harris. Trump didn't just win, Kamala also lost. And the lessons of her loss will have to be internalized by Trudeau and his Liberal Party because they occupy a similar space in the Canadian political context as Kamala and the Democrats did in the US. One particular analogy that we've talked about a few times in recent months is the question of whether Prime Minister Trudeau is basically in the same position that President Biden found himself in back in July. Biden, of course, was also quite unpopular. And after a terrible debate performance, a consensus emerged among Democratic elites that he should step down and let someone else lead the party in its campaign against Trump. And he did, and Kamala Harris took over, but the Democrats still lost anyway. And it's for that reason that I suspect Trudeau is probably now less likely to resign and let someone else take over the Liberal campaign, as some in his party had previously been demanding. Trudeau might be as unpopular as Biden, but no one is questioning his lucidity, so the objective necessity of him stepping down feels less urgent in that sense, especially if the potential downsides of him doing so are now clearer. For example, the fact that no one voted for Kamala became such a popular criticism during her candidacy will surely give Trudeau's Liberal Party some pause. Even though there is enough time for the Liberals to elect someone to replace Trudeau in a competitive party primary, in a way there wasn't for Kamala, in Canadian politics, it is tradition for the Prime Minister to resign the Prime Ministership altogether when the incumbent party wants to run somebody new. I've always hated this tradition because I think it cheapens the office of Prime Minister. And voters tend to agree, which is why Prime Ministers who get the job this way don't usually proceed to win elections. But the point is, if no one elected Kamala was a convincing rebuke against someone who didn't even get elected as a candidate, just imagine how much stronger it becomes when you're using it against someone who was never elected to be Prime Minister, but somehow wound up in charge anyway. On a more cynical note, if Trudeau was to step down, it is quite possible that the person who replaces him could be a woman, maybe even a woman of color. And, you know, while we can never know for sure how much that played a role in Kamala's defeat, it was probably more than zero. Fair or not, I think that the resentment factor can increase a lot when a progressive party is seen as imposing a DEI hire candidate on the public, which is a good transition into another major theme that has defined analysis of Trump's win, which is this whole question as to whether or not progressives have gotten too obnoxiously politically correct, or woke, as we now say. Despite all of the retroactive declarations that inflation was the dominant issue of the presidential race,